In 1980, Nintendo, new to the arcade scene, developed a shooting game titled Radar Scope, an unambitious, mediocre title that harbored little demand, leaving Nintendo sitting on a stock of 2,000 unsold cabinets. Enter coding prodigy / amateur spelunker Shigeru Miyamoto. See, Shiggy's plan was to repurpose the cabinets with a new game that wouldn't require a change of internal hardware. So he got hard at work making a game based on the classic Fleischer animation character Popeye. However, the licensing talks fell through, so Shiggs, being an artist himself, just made up some characters right then and there on the spot, you know? That character wound up being Mario, who is now the most recognizable fictional character in history, apparently, according to a somewhat dubious survey of American children taken 30 years ago. Not too sure about that. Regardless, Donkey Kong single-handedly pioneered the platforming genre and was a global phenomenon that put Nintendo on the map and earned Miyamoto his place among the top brass at the company. While the Japanese Nintendo was setting the world ablaze, around the same time in jolly old England, something else was happening. You see, game development was quite different in the UK than Japan. Whereas the coders of the Rising Sun made their products in white-collar offices wearing suits and ties with this stuffy corporate atmosphere, the British coding scene was more focused on amateurs. See, Europe had these awful pieces of shit called microcomputers, which were like normal computers but smaller and also terrible. They were, however, very user-friendly, so anybody with a little tech savvy could create their own software without any sort of economic barriers. In fact, many Euro publishers at the time would accept submissions from anonymous developers, or bedroom coders, as they were known. If a game was good enough, the publisher would sell it in exchange for a flat rate, one-time payment with no royalties, which frankly sounds like a scam. Among the thousands and thousands of bedroom coders were Tim and Chris Stamper, a pair of brothers infatuated with the ZX Spectrum. In 1983, they released Jetpack, which is kind of like the bastard child of Joust and Fantasy Zone, I guess. They dubbed their company Ultimate, Play the Game, and would continue to release games throughout the 80s, most notably Saberwolf. The Stampers, being hardcore technophiles, imported a Japanese Famicom, dismantled it, and reverse-engineered the entire console. They were impressed, to say the least. More importantly, they wanted to make games for the console. Ultimate would eventually migrate to the NES, where they released dozens of games, most notably RC Pro-Am and the iconic Battletoads, were starting to prove themselves a very valuable asset to the Nintendo brand. While all this was happening over in North America, Mainframe Entertainment, creators of the Grammy Award-winning music for the Dire Straits' Money for Nothing, were workshopping a full-fledged animated series using the latest state-of-the-art Silicon graphics workstations. That show would evolve into Reboot, which first aired in 1994. Now, none of this is really relevant, but I just wanted an excuse to use B-roll of Reboot.
It's absolutely nothing.
Naturally, the Stamper brothers had acquired some SGI units to call their own. Ultimate went into a short hiatus as they grew accustomed to this newish technology, hoping to master it just as they'd done with the ZX and the NES. They created some demos, and Nintendo was incredibly impressed with the visual splendor the English lads created. Reflecting on their previous successes on Nintendo platforms, they bought the majority share of the company.
Okay!
Extremely confident in their abilities, Nintendo offered Rare the opportunity to develop a game starring one of their intellectual properties, and the Stamper brothers decided to go with Donkey Kong. While Donkey Kong was shaping up quite nicely, the team decided they wanted to try something new. Of course, by this point it was 1994. We already had Super Turbo, Darkstalker, Samurai Showdown, Virtua Fighter, Fatal Fury, King of Fighters, plenty more. Tekken was on the way later that year. What I'm trying to say is, fighting games were the big thing, and it was time for the bedroom coders to step out of the home and into the cutthroat market of the arcade industry. Could Rareware succeed where Big Daddy N failed? Probably.
Available for your home in 1995, only on Nintendo Ultra 64. Killer Instinct.
Now, backpedaling a bit, earlier that year, Nintendo and Midway entered a contract whereby Midway could use the patented
Nintendo Ultra 64.
the basis for their own proprietary arcade cabinets. The idea was to have Midway create arcade games and then effortlessly port them exclusively to Nintendo's home consoles, kind of like what Sega would end up doing with the Naomi and the Dreamcast, as well as like with the STV, the Saturn, pretty much everything that Sega had done for like the duration of their existence. Of course, Rare were ever eager to try new things, was ready to dive headfirst into an industry they barely knew, working on a game in a genre they knew absolutely nothing about.
What could possibly go wrong?
The team wanted the game to stand out visually, so it was decided that Killer Instinct would utilize the same visual techniques they'd employed to make Donkey Kong Country, by which a highly detailed 3D model is posed frame by frame, then compiled into color-indexed 2D sprites. The key difference here was the flexibility and fidelity afforded by high-end arcade hardware. Now they had far less limitations in regards to sprite and tile size, as well as the amount of available on-screen colors, allowing the game's visuals to flourish. Recent hire Chris Tilston was tasked with most of the game's visuals. Utilizing a cutting-edge motion capture suit, he recorded a vast majority of the movements that acted as the basis for the game's animations. Many of the workers had a glut of characters they wanted to create, but ultimately character designs were chosen based on what special effects they could render in Maya. They wanted to blow audiences away with spectacle, ergo you have Glacius with his frozen skin, the molten cinder, the shiny reflective Fulgor, so on and so forth. Of course, not every character was chosen because they look good in a CGI highlight reel. Some, like Saberwolf, who you might remember being the villain from Rare's ZX Spectrum game, was chosen simply because he's a cool werewolf. And werewolves are cool. And also, they're totally not furries, I assure you. As a result of this mindset, the game's roster is a complete mishmash of random freaks and weirdos. You know, whereas other fighting games of the time had more consistent theming, like Street Fighter II was international martial artists, Sam's Show was like medieval sword fighters, Fatal Fury is like, this is what Japanese people think Miami is like, I guess. Killer Instinct had the aforementioned elemental humanoids, a werewolf, a robot, an ancient Mayan, a ninja, a fucking dinosaur, a skeleton, and TJ, who's just some guy. The game's stages would not be outmatched by its characters either. The Ultra 64 cabinet had a hard drive. It was in fact the first arcade game to sport such a feature. This afforded the game a tremendous amount of digital real estate for not only their high-resolution sprites, but movies as well. The backgrounds in Killer Instinct 1 are not tile or sprite-based, but rather videos rendered at 320 by 240 at 60 frames per second. It actually scrubbed back and forth individual frames based on the screen position. This allowed them to create stages with model and texture detail far beyond the cabinet's actual 3D capabilities, while simultaneously conveying the illusion that the fight was occurring in 3D space, or with all the perspective shifting. It's an incredibly clever workaround to hardware limitations. It actually still holds up to this day. So they had a game that was visually striking, full of all sorts of weird and esoteric characters, absolutely brimming with creative energy. So what better way to tie the whole aesthetic package together than with an equally outlandish soundtrack? KI's soundtrack was the brainchild of Robin Beanland and Graham Norgate, who go on to define the sound of Rare in a multitude of games, most notably GoldenEye. Unlike most of its contemporaries, KI's music made an impression for itself by being, well, contemporary. The soundtrack features a lot of club, dance, and new jack swing tracks, as furnished by Beanland. As for gameplay, well, blokes at Rareware weren't exactly savvy to the inner workings of the genre, so to keep things simple, Kevin Bayliss and Chris Tilston employed a 6-button Capcom-style layout. You know, back to block, no throws, very no-frills stuff, very basic. But then, Ken Lobb, better known as the Shitty Gun from GoldenEye, proposed the auto-double system, by which using a normal after a hit confirm will grant set attack 2 active frames instead of 1, enabling the player to extend the combo. This simple idea had a drastic effect on the game's direction. They quickly decided to make their entire game extremely combo-centric. Of course, having a game with 37 hit combos would mean matches would just boil down to a race to get the first touch of death hit confirm, right? So to negate the idea of impenetrable offense, they devised a mechanic by which the defending player could cancel their own hit stun. They quickly perform a special after a hit confirm, and thus the world was introduced to the
Combo Breaker!
Yo, check this out!
The most tantalizing thing about Killer Instinct, however, was the peek at the future it represented. The game's a track demo promised that this high-end, bleeding-edge game would be
Available for your home in 1995, only on Nintendo Ultra 64.
And, yeah, about that. See, remember when I said Nintendo had licensed the N64 guts to Midway to use as a basis for their hardware? Well, Nintendo kind of deviated from that initial plan. It turns out that KI would in fact not be available in our homes in 1995 only on Nintendo Ultra 64, since our homes would lack a Nintendo Ultra 64 due to it not existing. So Rare was sitting on a gold mine. They had a huge successful arcade game, yet they were contractually obligated to only release on Nintendo consoles, none of which could possibly run such a sophisticated game. Quite the conundrum. What were they to do? Compromise. And compromise they did. The Super Nintendo port looks like shit, it sounds like shit, the sprites are too small. I mean, it's not a terrible game by any means, but it's pretty rough going from the Ultra 64 cabinet to this sad but ambitious little cartridge. Credit where credit's due. They achieved the impossible and got KI in our homes in 1995. Granted, it was on Super Nintendo, but I mean, well, you take what you can get. By the time
Nintendo Ultra 64,
or now simply called the Nintendo 64, was released in 1996, Killer Instinct 2 was already widely available in arcades, so they ported that game instead. Dubbed it Killer Instinct Gold, finally completing the prophecy of having Killer Instinct in your home on Nintendo 64, except not really, because the Nintendo 64 was actually extremely underwhelming in terms of performance and, like, everything else. So, Killer Instinct Gold is basically a different game. That aside, Rare truly found their home on Nintendo 64, releasing mediocre platformers, excellent FPS games, and, whatever Blast Core would be classified as, all of which sold very well. Really vindicated Nintendo's acquisition of the company, which is why Nintendo, geniuses that they are, decided to liquidate their assets to Microsoft in 2001, where they would make literally nothing worth talking about for 12 years. And then that's when it happened.
coming to your home in 2013, only on Xbox One! Killer Instinct.
After years of nothing but Viva Pinata and Kinect games, Microsoft outsourced development of a new Killer Instinct to Double Helix and Iron Galaxy. The Killer Instinct reboot, released for Xbone in 2013, simply titled Killer Instinct but better known as Killer Instinct 2013, stands as one of the genre's finest games, period. If you want to learn about the development of that game, got this great full-length documentary by my boy Esteban Martinez. It's like an hour and 40 minutes. It's excellent. It goes into mad detail. It's got interviews, the whole shebang. Best of all, this new game, it's got Brash from Battletoads. Do you remember Battletoads? I brought that up before. Remember that? I said we were coming back to it, and we came full circle. You know, like KI 13. That's like, it's like their King of Fighters, bro. You know, he's got Banjo-Kazooie pants and shit. This is their King of Fighters. Yo, man, who else is in there? Yo, we got the Halo guy, the Halo alien with the energy sword, right? Shit's wild, bro. Yo, they gotta add some more dudes. Yo, who else can they add? I'm struggling to even remember Rare characters. I guess Grabbed by the Ghoulies? That's a Rare game, right? What else did they make? Beats the shit out of me.